Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Feed Additives and Intended Renewals Applications webinar. This is the second webinar organized in the frame of the new series of webinars organized by EFSA in support to applicants and other stakeholders in the understanding of the requirements of the transparency regulation, its processes, and the tools. My name is Margherita Guidi. I'm the Communication Officer of the Applications Desk Unit, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Together with me, there is a team of EFSA colleagues. We have three presenters: Karine Leroux, who's head of the Applications Desk Unit, Anastasia Livaniu, Scientific Officer of AppDesk Unit, and Simone Gabbi, team leader of the Transparency and Confidentiality team. Together with us, there are also some Q&A contributors, which are Stefano Capè, Sara De Berardis, Cinzia Percivaldi, and Francesca Volpi. These colleagues will be helping us out with the handling and the management of the questions that we will receive throughout the webinar. Presenters will go through the various phases of the application procedure for feed additives, including intended renewal applications throughout this webinar. Of course, you can submit questions via the Q&A feature, which you find on the top navigation menu of your interface. And our Q&A contributors, as named earlier, will address them either in written or live during the dedicated Q&A session in the last part of this webinar. What is the goal of this webinar today? The aim is to explain the steps and the tools of the application procedure for feed additives, including intended renewal applications, and also I want to address those questions which we have received by the applicants in the previous months as of the entry into application of the transparency regulation. Just some golden rules that we need to follow for the good handling of this webinar and that you should be aware of. Please submit your question via the Q&A tab of your user interface. Some of the questions, as I was mentioning, will be answered live during the Q&A session, while some others will be addressed orally. Questions which remain unanswered will not be addressed after the webinar, but obviously you are free to resubmit them via the Ask a Question tool, which you find on the EFSA website. Considering the high number of attendees today at the webinar and being this webinar entirely live, in case we should encounter any technical issues, we kindly ask you to bear with us. We are all connected remotely from home, so obviously we hope our home connections work fine, but in case not, please bear with us for that. For the best handling of this webinar, just a few more words on how the interface works. You are automatically connected to the audio broadcast. There is only one-way audio mode, so you are connected in listen-only mode. This webinar is being recorded and it's in English, so all questions should be also submitted in English throughout the webinar and through the platform. Having said this, I move it to our first speaker of today, the Head of Applications Desk Unit, Karine Leroux, who will guide you through the first steps of the application procedure. Over to you, Karine.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. Welcome. I'm Karine Leroux. I'm head of the Application Desk Unit, and I will be very happy to go through this application procedure dedicated to feed additive. So in the next slide, we will have the basis now for the new workflow or for the modification of the workflow on application, which is a transparency regulation taking place in entering into force 27th of March. And that will apply to all the new dossier, new application, new submission as of 27th of March 21. So 4 pillars that are the basis of the transparency regulation. A better transparency with access to study, access to document, access to information submitted and supporting the dossier. More reliable independent studies with the access to the scientific evidence requesting an authorization. a better governance with involvement of member states in contributing to EFSA governance and the scientific panels, and an effective risk communication. How does it translate? We will have in the workflow highlighted in color the changes that are implemented. And you will see that most of the changes are in the part mandate and dossier intake, so before the submission. We have the pre-intake activity, pre-submission advice, notification of study. We will have the validity check that will include a notification of study check, so an additional element. The publication of the non-confidential dossier, being part of the transparency aim of the transparency regulation, the assessment of confidentiality to be done by EFSA, and the consultation of the public. This is in the intake phase. The preparatory steps are the same for EFSA. In the risk assessment, you might see here, in case during the risk assessment you are requested for additional information, EFSA will perform, and you claim confidentiality, EFSA will also perform an assessment of this confidentiality claim. At the level of the output and publication, all the steps are as before, just at the level of the publication, and here also to reinforce the transparency aim of the transparency regulation. It's not only the publication of the scientific output, but it's also the supporting evidence. And in case there was a request for or submission of the confidential data during the risk assessment, a review of the previously adopted confidential decision. So this is the overview of the workflow. And in the next slide, we will see which are the tools. So EFSA has developed, together with the Commission, tools to support this way of working. And you will find, as business operator, consultant, you will find on Connect EFSA, the area where you will connect to access to the functionalities of the notification of studies, the pre-submission advice, ask a question, the public access to documents, and public consultation. The e-submission food chain platform developed by the Commission was early developed already in the year 2018, and has been adapted to all the different workflow. For the feed additive, that's your place to submit the dossier. So here you will submit your dossier, you will submit and receive and submit the request for additional information, and you will follow up the life cycle of your application. OpenEFSA is the public domain, is where anyone can go and follow the monitoring of the risk assessment flow, the dissemination portal, and the proactive disclosure of information. Another tool that has been recently developed and made available, very particular, the Portalino. We have a webinar and training material available on the website. This Portalino is to be used exclusively if you have confidential requests in the context of application dataset, documents supporting the generic mandates. So if it's not in the frame of the e-submission food chain and data contains confidentiality, Portalino is to be used. We will see later on a slide dedicated. So let's go to the next step. Thank you. So first step is to register, to create an account, to be able to access this workflow. We have a process to register, and first message to everyone needs to register, being a business operator or a laboratory or testing facility or a third party. So each individual as an organization needs to register. We have material that have been developed, recorded, that are available on the training page of EFSA. You will be able to see the detailed user guide. So here I'm highlighting to you some highlights. So first step is as an organization to register independently of your role. In the next slide, where do you do this step? You can go to the Connect EFSA, and you have a box, a green box, register to the portal. Here you are asked to, as an applicant, to register as an entity. So it's the legal entity of the organization which is asked to be registered. And then the account name. If we can see in the next slide, we can see what do we ask. So the organization is registered, and then you have contact person. And the contact person is an individual person. So you are asked to register as an individual, and functional mailbox are not used. That's the tool that we have used that is really about individual. So it's an individual email. Good news, following many requests we had, the number of accounts under an organization can move from 3 to 6. So we have increased the number since very soon, since the 30th of June. So we are adapting also to the requests that we receive. So under one organization with a legal entity, 6 contact persons can be registered. How does it work? You do this step of registration, then EFSA will check for security reason, will check the account, and after a few days, will validate the account. So we had at the beginning, the first weeks, the first 20 days after the 27th of March, a huge amount of account to create. It took a bit longer, and if it's a reason to justify a delay, that's a reason, no access. But since now many weeks, we are at a speed cruise, I would say. And if you have done a request for an account, it should be solved in few days, or you are contacted or the account is created. So if you are still in a situation with no account created since many weeks, come back to us. This is not normal. We are really validating and all accounts in a very speedy mode. On the next slide, an attention point. An attention point of an improvement that we have done in the tool following feedback is for the business operator that asks a third party to act on behalf of them. Many situations very recurrent for the feed additive. So here, since the 30th of April, a business operator is registered. A third party is registered as an account, and the business operator has the possibility to assign the third party with an account relationship. So if the business operator declares in the tool that the third party Martin is acting on behalf of, from that moment, Martin will be able to notify on behalf of Sarah. So this we have improved in the tool. On the next slide, another improvement that came out more recently, the 30th of June, coming again from experience and feedback, is the fact that Sarah can be a business operator, but can also be a laboratory representative and can be a third party in another context. So this multiple hat for one person, we have also improved in the tool, and the organization now are able to play multiple roles. You will find some videos to explain this on EFSA website. We also have very nice user guide that have been recently published to explain you full of information on account creation, notification of study, and pre-submission advice. Okay, the accounts are created, and I think on the next slide, okay, again, another point, because it's a recurrent question that we receive, is how to ask a consultant to act on behalf of, and how to give this, recognize this relationship in the tool to allow the third party or the consultant to act. So this is the procedure which is detailed. It's coming from the business operator at the beginning. Okay, on the next slide, we are perhaps moving to the pre-submission phase. And here again, on the next slide, we start with a new application. And on the next slide, I'll go quickly because you will find on the webpage of EFSA many videos, training material that have been recorded, user guide recently published, and upcoming videos. So some highlights. To start, any activity on the Connect EFSA as a business operator or representative on behalf of, you need to create a pre-application ID. 3 elements to define a pre-application ID. The subject of the application, this is an application for feed additive XYZ. The intended area, feed additive, regulation 1831/2003, and the business operator, Sarah. This characterizes a pre-application ID. On the next slide, once you have created your pre-application ID, you are able to request a general pre-submission advice at any time. So anytime before submission, you can ask a general pre-submission advice. EFSA will provide the advice. The request is mainly in the way of a written form. It might be in the way of a virtual meeting upon decision of EFSA, but EFSA will provide the advice, will communicate the advice to the business operator, and will issue a summary of the advice and store it. This is stored in our database, in our system. Once the application is validated, EFSA will publish the summary of the pre-submission advice, and this is part of the transparency of the workflow. If EFSA has engaged as communication with the applicant before, we have the summary of the pre-submission advice, which is published together with the content of the application at validity. So on the next slide, we will see in the scenario of the notification of study. So again, the applicant has a pre-application ID. He can notify studies, but the business operator, the third party, the laboratory can. So many actors can notify. This enters in our database of notification of study. And at the moment of submission of the application, EFSA will perform the validation of the application, considering the notification of study check, which means that we verify the content of the dossier versus the information in the database. And if there's any differences, we look at the justification. Here again, at the moment of validation of the application, EFSA publishes the study notification with the related studies once the confidentiality decision-making process has been finalized. So this is for the new application. Now for the intended renewal of application, few slides to explain the process. The general pre-submission advice of a renewal is the same. The only difference is that you need to request a pre-application ID for renewal. Then the rest you can ask anytime your request, and the steps are the same. On the next slide, we will see that for the renewal pre-submission advice, the notification of study, the applicant gets a pre-application ID, and the applicant needs mandatory to submit a list of intended studies, including the study design. This is mandatory from the practical arrangement. This is submitted in the database of the notification of study. And when there's a public consultation on the list of intended studies, and based on this information, EFSA will provide the advice. So the advice on the renewal pre-submission advice is given to the applicant. The same then for the new application. The summary of the comments are stored. And then the applicant can notify the studies according to Article 32B at any time. An attention point, because it's comments that we receive or we've observed that it's not always so clear. An applicant might cover several application types, but if you have a renewal, the renewal pre-submission advice will only provide studies intended to support the renewal. So the study intended to support a modification of an authorization should not be notified in the list of intended studies. So make clear that even if you have an application with different scope, the list of intended studies only relates to the intended studies of renewal. And on the next slide, another attention point also, renewal means you had submitted an application before. So once you register your pre-application ID, we ask you to indicate the number, the reference to the former application ID. So in the context of renewal, make the link with the first application ID you have been using. This is to facilitate the work. Here we would like to highlight how important it is when you do the list of intended studies to comply with the requirement of the practical arrangement. And we have put again on the right side the must-have information before an intended study for renewal can be submitted. We will do a check of what is submitted before the public consultation, and it has to comply with the practical arrangement, in particular the list of the scope, study scope and study design. You know that the intended studies for renewal, very important to have the study design of the study. It's part of the quality of the study, so an attention point here to have it all the time. With this overview, I think I've done with the overview of the pre-submission activity, and I'm giving the floor to Anastasia Livaniu to drive us through the next step. Thank you.
Anastasia, I think you can start. You should be live already.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anastasia Livaniu. I'm a scientific officer at the Applications Desk Unit. And today I will give a short introduction to the e-submission food chain platform. For some of you, perhaps this is not an entirely new activity, because the FSCAP version 1 of this platform has been operational since January 2018 for the preparation of novel foods and traditional foods applications. But from the moment that the transparency regulation came into force, and in order to facilitate compliance with certain transparency regulation aspects like the notification of studies, confidentiality assessment, or dissemination of dossiers, this version 1 was extended to version 2, and e-submission food chain platform was born. It can support all different regulated product areas, excluding pesticides. And in the right-hand side of this slide, you can also see all the different food domains and application types that are supported, of course, including feed additives, that is the topic of today's webinar. This platform is meant to serve as the single point of entry for the applicants to prepare, submit, and follow up on their applications, but also by European Commission and Member States users to receive these applications, but also perform certain risk management activities. At the bottom of this slide, you can also see that will be made available to you afterwards, after this webinar. You can also find links to the video tutorials and the user guide of the platform, as well as the link to access the platform directly. And at this stage, I will stop the presentation to move straight to the demonstration of this platform. As soon as you manage to log in, you will land on your on the dashboard of the application. The dashboard is able to host applications that are either already submitted, like the ones you see here, and you can see also the submission date, or applications that are in draft. Of course, at the beginning, when you start playing and trying to familiarize yourself, you might create some applications that you don't need anymore, but you can always delete them. At the left-hand side, you can access support material, information on the user guide, the EFSA guidance documents, and most importantly, the email to receive support from the European Commission support team while filling in your application. At the top right of your screen, we have this button, Create a New Application. While you click on this button, you go through 3 different steps. These steps will help you will guide you to select the appropriate application type for which you wish to apply. In your case, the first step, you select the food domain. In our case, it is feed additives. The same we select at the second step. And at the third step, we have to select if our application is related to a new, entirely new feed additive, or a new use, a modification, or a renewal of an already authorized food additive. We also have the option for Article 15 applications for urgent authorization. For the purpose of this webinar, I will select the combination of a renewal with something else. So I will start the process. By doing these three steps, the system will generate the template that is adapted to the needs of the scientific guidance for feed additives. All different application types, of course, also the feed additive templates, they are split in three main sections: the administrative data section, the public summary, and the technical dossier. The administrative data, we can go through the steps here together. It starts with the applicant's contact details, where you're expected to fill in the information on who is the applicant. If the applicant is outside the EU, we also require to give information on who is the EU representative of the applicant. Then we would like to also have information on the person who is responsible for the dossier and the person that we can contact in relation to this application. Moving on, in the administrative data, we have the subject of the request. At this point, I would like to draw your attention to these little bubbles with question marks that you see to the right-hand side, where once you click on them, you can access some additional contextual help on what is expected from you in relation to this particular section. So in this case, for the subject of the request, we want you to provide the name of the substance, the preparation, or the microorganism for which you are applying for authorization. So in this case, it would be enough to insert substance A, for example. Moving on, we ask you to select the scope of the application. In this case, we can select a renewal, and my renewal application, in this case, it's also, let's say, applying for a new use of the additive already authorized. Then, after the scope of the application, we have some sections in relation to existing authorizations in EU food, feed, or GMO legislation, as these are also described in Annex 1 of the feed additives regulation. At the very end, the last section of the administrative data, you are required to download from the European Commission website the application form set out in Annex 1 and also upload it here in this platform. At this point, I would like to mention that very recently there was an update of the EFSA administrative guidance, specifically on this aspect, that is also now indicating that uploading of this application form is also required. And this is now published and it is updated on our website. In the public summary section, you're just required to upload a file for the public summary that contains no personal or confidential information. And on the technical dossier, as mentioned earlier, this is structured according to the data requirements as these are defined in the scientific guidance. You will notice that you can click and expand and collapse the different sections and subsections. And you are invited to either provide documents or there are some other sections that you can give some structured information. Now I would like to draw your attention to aspects that are different compared to the old way of submitting applications. And the first item to focus is the pre-application information. A bit earlier, Karin talked to us about the pre-application information, pre-application ID concept. So if you have engaged with EFSA for pre-application activities, either pre-submission advice or notification of studies, and you have received a pre-application ID, you can provide this here. If not, it's still fine because it's not mandatory. You just move ahead to the next section. Then, within the pre-application information still, if there are studies that you have notified, but you are not submitting in your application, here you're invited to give the ID number received when notifying the study, but also give a justification on why this study was not included in your application. Another aspect that is also important here and is changing again, it has to do with the way of preparing and submitting the main text of your dossier and the annexes and references. Until now, you were preparing a single standalone main text, whereas now, since the dossier is fragmented in the different sections and subsections, you are also invited to provide in the corresponding section one file, one document referring to the main text, but also all the relevant annexes and references within the same section. And I can show you here an example. So if we are here, we are in the safety of use of the additive for the target animals. I browse to upload a file. Once I upload the file and the system is loading that file, the system will ask me to define the document type for that specific file that I have uploaded. So in this case, I will select a document type from a list of already defined, and the system will offer me the list of possible document types that I can select from. And here you can see that, for example, I can select technical dossier text, I can select publication, study report, cover letter, or other supporting documents if I cannot find the dedicated, the most appropriate document type. So in this case, I will select technical dossier. If for this section I wish to continue uploading further documents, I will click on Add a document. And let's say that in this case, I wish to upload a study. And again, in this case, I need to select the appropriate document type again. In this particular case, since I'm uploading a study, the appropriate document type is study report. As soon as I select study report, and this is happening only for studies, only for the study reports document type, the system will offer some additional details that I need to fill in. So in this case, I will select document type study report, and you see that I'm required to fill in some more information. This is related, again, going back to the practical arrangements document, defining that for each study that is provided in the dossier, we need to either have a notification of studies ID or a justification if this study was not notified. So in this case, if my study is notified, I will say here yes and give the EFSA study identification. Whereas if the study is not notified, I will just say no and give the justification why the study was not notified. Another aspect changing compared to the old way of submitting applications has to do with the request of confidentiality, the confidentiality requests. To do that, I have to do this per file submitted. I would click here at the right-hand side, the menu, Request Confidentiality. And now the system defines two mandatory elements for me to do once I request confidentiality for a file. The first is to provide the non-confidential version of the file that I have just submitted, and also to define and build my confidentiality request. To do that, I have to select from a list of already predefined legal grounds, give the justification, the part of the text for which confidentiality is requested, and the location in the text. It is possible to add more than one confidentiality requests per file. Once I fill in all of my dossier, I fill in all the different elements, I'm able now to submit my dossier. I would now like to show you a document, a dossier that is already submitted. Once you submit your dossier, a new section appears at the left-hand side. It's called Overview. And here you're able to see and track the life cycle of your dossier, and you can see all the relevant events in relation to your application from the moment the application was received by the European Commission, when this was forwarded to EFSA, when the question number was assigned, until the very end, when the opinion was adopted, or even all the risk management steps until the end of the authorization procedure. And with this remark on the timeline, I would now like to go back to the presentation and give you a few more details on what happens to your application from the moment it arrives to EFSA, and some details on portal updates and validity of application. Once your application is forwarded to EFSA, your application is registered in the EFSA systems and the question number is assigned. The question number, along with the mandate number that we receive from the European Commission, will be made available to you through the submission portal. But at the same time, this will become also visible in the Open EFSA portal. At this very, very early stage, we only show the subject of the application, the name of the applicant, but also the date that the dossier was received in EFSA. This is also when the completeness check can start. This is an activity for EFSA. Through which it is possible that we also perform the notification of studies check if this is relevant and there were applications notified before the submission. Following this completeness check, EFSA might come back to the applicant asking for missing information, and the applicant is able to receive and reply to all these requests again through the e-submission platform. Once all additional data is provided and all questions are answered, EFSA declares the application as valid. From that moment onwards, EFSA has to publish the non-confidential version of the dossier immediately at the Open EFSA portal. So the dossier practically will become available again in the same page that initially only the question number and the subject was published. Now we will also publish the non-confidential valid dossier. And from that moment onwards, the confidentiality assessment and the risk assessment activities can start. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Simone to give you a bit more details on the confidentiality assessment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Simone, you're live. You can go on.
Thank you. Thank you, Margherita. Thank you, Anastasia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simone Gabbi, and I'm a team leader for transparency and confidentiality within the legal and assurance services of the European Food Safety Authority. We have already seen how the confidentiality submission process works in practice in ESFC. So we should now take a step back and consider certain theoretical aspects you have to comply with in order to submit a successful confidentiality request. First, let me highlight again that the proactive disclosure set out in the transparency regulation that Karin already anticipated and highlighted requires EFSA to make proactively available all documents, datasets, studies, and information that are supporting application dossiers. This happens at the moment of validity of the application dossier in the non-confidential version submitted by the applicant. However, then EFSA may be required to update this initial non-confidential version with the sanitized version implementing its own confidentiality decisions. These confidentiality decisions are taken on the basis of the information included in the confidentiality requests that are submitted by the applicants. It is therefore very important to understand that the burden of proof for the submission of successful confidentiality request lies exclusively on the applicant's shoulders. Pending the adjudication, the decision of EFSA on the confidentiality request submitted by the applicants, EFSA, the rapporteur, the member states, or the Commission will not disclose information that has been claimed confidential by the applicant. I've also to highlight that what I'm saying in this presentation is relevant for confidentiality decisions that are taken by EFSA alone. In other sectors, the confidentiality decision-making power is still assigned to the Commission or to the rapporteur member states. But let's focus on this sector in particular. In terms of procedural requirements that you have to comply with, first and foremost, the confidentiality requests we have seen have to be sent through the e-submission food chain platform managed by the Commission. Therefore, for instance, a submission by email will not be considered by EFSA. The submission of a confidentiality request must include verifiable justification, as well as a confidential and non-confidential version of the documents that is submitted, and we have seen how this happens in ESFC. Once a confidentiality request is submitted, the applicant may not improve it, may not modify it after submission, unless it is requested to do so by EFSA. Clarifications or modifications have to be provided by the deadline that is set by EFSA in the request for clarification. Failure to submit such a clarification or modification by the deadline will result in EFSA rejecting the confidentiality request. We're also pleased to share that no fees are to be paid or charges are to be paid by the applicant for the processing of this confidentiality request. In terms of procedural requirements, it's also important to underline that confidentiality requests may be submitted only with regard to items that are on the closed positive list set out for this sector in Article 18, paragraph 3 of the feed additives regulation. And therefore, in particular, with regard to these two items listed on this slide, the study plans for study demonstrating efficacy of a feed additive, as well as specifications of the impurities of the active substance and the relevant methods of analysis. Now, this is important to understand. These sectors, these specific items are relevant only for this particular sector. Plus, in addition, we have also to allow, and you are allowed to submit valid confidentiality requests also for what concerns items that are set out in Article 39.2 of the General Food Law Regulation, as it's indicated in the previous provision. And these are the manufacturer production process, as well as commercial links between a producer or importer and the applicant, as well as commercial information revealing sourcing, market shares, etc., or quantitative composition of the subject matter of the request. Then it's important to understand that since all information that is supporting an application dossier will be disclosed proactively by EFSA, this proactive disclosure will also include personal data that are relevant and that are part of this application dossier. It is therefore important that an applicant submits a confidentiality request also for the personal data that they do not want to be disclosed, are disclosed. And in particular, obviously, for what concerns individuals, names and addresses of individuals involved in testing on vertebrate animals or in obtaining toxicological information. This applies also to other personal data, except for the name and addresses of the applicant, as well as the names of authors of published studies or publicly available studies, which are systematically to be disclosed by EFSA as part of the proactive disclosure requirements. In addition to the need to comply with procedural requirements, in order to submit a valid confidentiality and successful confidentiality request, the applicant has also to comply with substantive requirements that are listed in this slide, obviously just in a summarized manner. For a comprehensive description, please refer to EFSA's practical arrangements concerning transparency and confidentiality. First and foremost, the applicants have to identify clearly and flag the information that is claimed confidential, including links and references throughout the application dossier where this information may be found. Second, they have to indicate, as we have seen, the legal basis or grounds for the submission of this confidentiality request. And in particular, they have to highlight which of the items in the close positive list is to be considered as the relevant legal basis for the submission of the confidentiality request itself. The item should also be kept, the verifiable justification should also highlight the reason why the item should be kept confidential. The item should not, the confirmation that the item should not be in the public domain, as well as that the disclosure of the item will result in a potential harm to a significant degree. And in order to do so, the applicants may either confirm two rebuttable presumptions regarding the amount of harm that this disclosure would result in, as well as regarding the novelty of the information that is supposedly confidential, or in the alternative, providing a verifiable justification as to the reason why the disclosure of these items would anyway result in potential harm to a significant degree, even if these two rebuttable presumptions are not met. The applicant is also required to highlight whether the information claimed to be confidential is falling under the concept of environmental information set out in the ARUS regulation, and that the information has been acquired in a legitimate manner. So we have seen how the ESFC works, and this is simply, again, a picture showing you exactly where to put which parts of the verifiable justification, but fundamentally ESFC will provide you with the blueprint for a successful confidentiality request. So please follow that strictly, and also refer to the practical arrangements for more detailed explanations. We've also seen how published studies in a scientific journal may be protected from disclosure, that is by providing full citation and flagging the no IP right not owned field. But again, this is not a confidentiality request, strictly speaking. So just to highlight the availability of this feature. Once a confidentiality request is submitted through ESFC, it reaches EFSA's internal workflow, which is allowing the agency to track and process confidentiality requests that are received by the authority. Once the assessment by the legal unit is made on the confidentiality request, the draft decision on the confidentiality request is shared in a draft form with the applicant, and the applicant enjoys a 2 weeks timeline for the submission of their comments, or in the alternative, for the withdrawal of the application dossier. The withdrawal, if done at this step of the procedure, will prevent the disclosure of any information that is claimed to be confidential by the applicant itself. Obviously, it will also cancel the submission of the application, and therefore the scientific evaluation will also be will also reach its end. The withdrawal can also happen later during the scientific evaluation procedure or even after, but it has a different impact on the public availability of the information in question. And for more details on this point, please consult with EFSA's practical arrangements. Once this 2 weeks timeline is over, the EFSA will take into account the comments received by the applicant, if any, will finalize the confidentiality decision, and then will share the signed confidentiality decision with the applicant itself via ESFC or via an email if that is not available. And at this moment in time, the applicant will enjoy another 2 weeks timeline for the submission of a confirmatory application in case they disagree with the first decision on confidentiality. If they do so, the applicant may submit a confirmatory application via ESFC, or if this is unavailable, by sending an email to this functional mailbox mentioned in this slide. And following the submission of a confirmatory application, EFSA will issue another decision on the confirmatory application. At this moment in time, the legal remedy for bringing an action before the General Court of the European Union will be made available. In other words, in order to enjoy the right to challenge EFSA's confidentiality decisions, applicants have to submit a confirmatory application. They may not, according to the General Food Law, submit lodge a court case on the first confidentiality decision. Anyway, once this decision-making process on the confirmatory application is over, EFSA will implement the confidentiality decision in case these highlight a disagreement with the initial confidentiality request by the applicant, and EFSA will implement this decision by sanitizing the relevant documents, that is, substantially by blackening, if I may say so, and blackening the elements that it does not consider deserve confidential status. However, even after this step, once the scientific opinion of EFSA is adopted, EFSA may be required to review its confidentiality decisions, having awarded and confirmed confidential status to certain elements, and as claimed initially by the applicant, if the scientific output identifies a foreseeable effect on human health, animal health, or the environment. This is a specific procedure which is set out in Article 39C of the General Food Law, and which effectively triggers the reopening of the confidentiality decision-making process from scratch, limited to these items on which EFSA identified foreseeable effects on human health, animal health, or the environment. So we'll have an assessment, and we'll have a consultation of the applicant on the draft confidentiality decision, and then the finalization of the decision and the possibilities to submit a confirmatory application with the consequent decision on the confirmatory application. This is what I wanted to convey to you with regard to this topic, and therefore I thank you very much for having attended and remain available for questions later, and pass the floor back to my colleague, Erin. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. And we are progressing in the flow of our application. So welcome back again in this flow of the application of a feed additive, and we are moving now to the phase of the public consultation. So on the next slide, you will see several types of public consultation that EFSA has developed, but today we will see 2 types: the public consultation of the list of intended studies and the public consultation of a validated application. So on the next slide, we see the workflow of a validated application. So on step 1, the business operator or its representative submit an application which might contain confidentiality. We have seen with the presentation of Simone the confidentiality decision workflow. So there's a confidentiality decision issued. And then on step 3, the public consultation on the content of the non-confidential dossier is launched for 3 calendar weeks. So it's a fixed timeline of 3 weeks for each public consultation. The aim of this public consultation is to collect new additional evidence to assess an application. Once the public consultation is finalized, we reach the step 4, and here we have 2 actions. The first one is that the comments received go immediately public on the OpenEFSA, on the dissemination portal. So it's an automatic step. And then the comments received go also in step 5 to the working group that will consider the comments received during the public consultation. And these comments and how they have been considered will be available in the context of an annex to the scientific opinion once the scientific opinion is finalized. So together with the final scientific output, you will find everyone, the public will find an annex with the outcome of the comments received. So this is about the transparency, considering as much information as possible. On the next slide, we will see the workflow in the case of a renewal. So list of intended study for renewal. Perhaps if I can have the next slide, we would see the flow. And the one before, the computer is taking some freedom to change the slide. So thank you. We are now in the renewal case. In this case, the public consultation is about the list of intended studies. So you had a renewal. We have seen previously, you submit a list of intended studies. Step 2, EFSA made an administrative check. This is a check to verify that the studies submitted comply with the mandatory fields of the practical arrangement. Then we launch a public consultation, which also have 3 calendar weeks, so fixed timeline for all these public consultation. Here, the aim of this public consultation is to inform the elaboration of the renewal pre-submission advice to a potential applicant. So it's about to collect feedback from the public on this list of intended studies. The list of the comments receive 2 steps. Step 4, they go immediately public on the public domain on OpenEFSA. So without delay, we publish the comments received on the dissemination portal, and they are brought to the attention to EFSA, which will consider the comments at the moment of providing the renewal pre-submission advice. So here, back to the information provided earlier, EFSA prepare and give a pre-submission advice renewal, issue a pre-submission advice renewal summary, which is stored. Once the application is valid, this renewal pre-submission advice summary will contain the outcome of the public consultation. So it's together with the pre-submission advice summary of the renewal. Where to find, so on the next slide, where to find the information on the public consultation, it's very easy. On Connect EFSA, it's very visible. You can find a green box public consultation, and here you have the list of public consultation open, planned, or closed. So on the next slide, we will go perhaps quickly to the last step, so which are the risk assessment adoption publication. Here is the flow which is standard, so it's always the same. I will just highlight in orange that if during the risk assessment additional information are requested, and if the information submitted contains confidentiality, EFSA will issue will assess again the confidentiality of this additional information. So here we have an assessment of confidentiality, and yes, and in the next slide, thank you, we have the final step. So final step when the opinion is adopted is that we have a notification. This is in our catalog of services. Then we do some editorial check from adoption. We pre-notify of a scientific output 36 hours before publication. So this is also in our standard procedure. And then we publish the scientific output together with the supporting evidence and, if applicable, to the review previously adopted confidentiality decision. Not desirable, but it might happen. We have a standard operating procedure to correct a published scientific output if needed. What is interesting to highlight, and I will take 1 minute just on this slide, is it might be that the scientific output is inconclusive. So in the case of an EFSA inconclusive scientific output, there's another workflow that can be followed, a follow-up workflow to complement the dossier. So in this case, the applicant has the possibility to submit complementary information containing the main document, the annex, the signed cover letter describing the content. This additional workflow is defined in the administrative guidance that have been prepared for you, dedicated to feed additive, and in the chapter 212 you have described here. So the novelty that we have here is the use of the Portalino. If in the submission of the complementary information you do have confidential information, you will be asked to use the Portalino to submit your confidential information. So we have, again, on the EFSA website, a live video that explains how to submit information in Portalino, which type of information to submit. So in this case, as a follow-up of inconclusive opinion, the applicant is able to submit the complementary information. If confidential information, the confidential information submitted via the Portalino. And here the applicability of the requirements of the transparency regulation will be on the notification of study that are applicable, the confidentiality we've discussed with the Portalino, and the proactive disclosure. Then the steps are the same of drafting a scientific output, endorsing, and publication. So in the next slide, we have collected some questions and answers from the applicant. Perhaps only the first one I could just highlight where to find information. So we have the feed additive application. You are able to find the regulation and the guidance. Just highlighted in yellow, a new document that have been provided, which is an analysis of the most frequent questions asked during the risk assessment. So as information flow to the applicant and the consultant that are preparing for the applicant. Perhaps here, because of time, we can go to some very frequent question that we receive, so that you have an answer. We do have questions about how to search information, how to search the information with a keyword and a reference to the former register of question search. So here, down on the right side of this slide, we give you some tips to find the information. You can still go in the question menu and insert the keyword for searching your results. For any application received before the 21st of January, the data have been migrated as a block, so it's more an Excel file that you can have. Second question is about a recurrent question about submission date. When should we submit a study in the notification? So for feed additive renewal, the data commissioned or carried out before the 27th of March is not subject to the study notification obligation. Is it correct? So here again, on the right side, you will find ample information to address this request. Not a study commissioned or carried out as of 27th of March have the obligation of the notification. You have also the practical arrangement question and answer available. So perhaps here I'm just highlighting two questions and I will give the floor back to Margherita. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Karine, and thank you all to the speakers for the very nice and clear presentations given. Indeed, we received several questions from our attendees, and considering the time we have allowed, I will quickly move now to the Q&A session, live Q&A session. And for this, I would kindly ask some Q&A contributors to come on the virtual stage. And in particular, I would start by calling Francesca for quite some questions received on the understanding of the practical arrangements. If you can join me on stage, Francesca, thank you. I will start with the first one, where we have an attendee asking if third parties should be in EU countries or could be also in Asia.
Thank you, Margherita, and good morning to everyone. I am Francesca Volpi. I'm a legal officer in the Legal and Assurance Services of EFSA. About the question, I would say the practical arrangements per se do not provide any specific requirement about, whether the third party should be or not based in the union or can be based outside. However, this should be also somehow taken into consideration looking at Article 4 of paragraph 3 of the FID regulation, in which there is this requirement that either the applicant or the representative should be located in the union. So somehow, but when submitting the application, okay, since basically when submitting the application, EFSA will carry out, the verification of compliance with the notification of studies, it is important that, we are able to make the match between who has notified and who has basically submitted the application. So I would say that if the company is a non-EU company, probably the third party, if it is the same third party that is notifying and then subsequently representing the applicant in the application process, would necessarily be European. And I think this is also replying to another question, Margaret, that we have received just after.
Indeed, yes, I can read it aloud for everybody to know. So the following question is how we have to proceed if we are working as consultant on behalf of an Asian company. Does the company have to be registered as business operator? This is the question, Francesca, over to you.
Thanks a lot. I would say yes. So because basically the business operator needs to be anyway registered. This is a requirement in the practical arrangements, and also the third party. So I think from that perspective, the situation is not special because of the nationality of the operator. The registration is anyway necessary.
Okay, many thanks. I'll ask you to stay on stage, and I have another question for you more related to pre-submission advice and the validity of application, which reads, do you have to get a pre-submission advice before having a valid application?
Okay, so one should distinguish. There are two types of pre-submission advice that are basically described and available according to transparency regulation. And these two possibilities or two basically requirements are also reflected in the practical arrangements. One thing is the general pre-submission advice. So it's basically a pre-submission advice can be requested optionally. So it's upon request, it's not definitely an obligation, and can be requested for all applications with a specific scope. So basically not all questions can be answered in this context, and you will find more details in the practical arrangements and in the transparency regulation itself. The renewal pre-submission advice is not upon request. It's basically an advice that is given by EFSA systematically, only in the case of renewal applications, and basically it follows the notification of the intended studies for renewal. So somehow is a separate workflow that also Karine described during her presentation. In this case, I would not say that this is an obligation. The obligation is to notify the intended studies. So then the renewal pre-submission advice is simply a consequence of the notification of the intended studies and is not a request.
Thank you. I will keep you for one more question for you, Francesca, which is about laboratories and related procedures. So the question goes like, laboratories are required to co-notify studies as well. What are the consequences if co-notification is not performed by the laboratory, for example, not without delay or not at all prior to submission?
The procedural consequences linked to the notification obligations are basically well described in the transparency regulation and in the practical arrangements, is paragraph 4 and 5. You will read from these provisions that basically EFSA will make an assessment of the compliance with the notification obligations, but and there are consequences in case basically these requirements are not respected by the operators. But I would say, you know, that the only consequence is on the applicants, and therefore, if the business operators correctly notified the study, no consequences will be applied. So they are not basically responsible at this stage for what the laboratory, if the laboratory eventually did not meet its own obligation.
Okay, thank you very much, Francesca, for your clear answers. For the following questions, I would like to ask Stefano to join us on the stage and to take some questions related more to the notification of studies, processes, and tools. If you can join me on stage, Stefano. I will start. Yes, I see you there. Okay. So the first question that I have here from our audience is if you can explain how to perform a notification for a study that needs to be commissioned with urgency by a potential applicant while the renewal pre-submission advice is still ongoing. Over to you, Stefano.
Thank you very much. I would like just to share my screen to help me with one slide. Okay, so this is so-called parallel notification according to Article 32C1 and Article 32B. It should be clarified that basically this situation should happen only in the first month of operation of transparency regulation. This functionality is currently not covered directly by the system, but we have proposed a workaround that is also very well explained in one of the video of the notification of study database webinar we had on the 25th of March. In summary, what happens is that the potential applicant prepare, as usual, the list of intended studies for renewal and submit it to EFSA. At this point, the renewal pre-submission advice, at this point, basically, what happens is that once the list is submitted to EFSA, the applicant cannot change anymore the list of intended studies for renewal or the intended studies. So it will be not possible, for example, to notify according to Article 32B. Obviously, it shall be reminded that it is important to notify according to Article 32B in case the business operator has actually to commission or carry out the study. Because these may be subject to sanction in phase of dossier submission. So this notification according to Article 32B in this case has to be performed. So if you have urgency to commission or carry out this study, you should use the functionality of study notification without a pre-application ID that you find through the study section of the database. This functionality is originally provided exclusively for the cases in which the study is requested by EFSA during the risk assessment process and the applicant didn't have any pre-submission activities. Therefore, a pre-application ID is not available. So in this case, you insert this study and you press notify. Since the notification is not valid if it is not connected to a pre-application ID, as soon as EFSA will release the renewal pre-submission advice, the pre-application ID becomes unblocked. Then you can, by using the function add study, to include this study to the pre-application ID. Of course, the original intended studies that you have submitted with the list of intended studies will remain in draft status. So you don't need to do anything for this notification. We are aware that the process is, let's say, a little bit complex, but as I have reminded, there are this video guide, video tutorial, and you can also refer to this video tutorial for this. I'm just sorry that for some strange reason the slides were blocked, but okay, more or less this was the scenario. Okay, thank you for this question.
Thank you, Stefano, for your answer. I have another one for you, so please stay on stage. And this one is more related to the new functionalities that we have developed as of the entry into application of the transparency regulation. So the question is, what are the new functionalities inserted in the last release of the notification of study database? If you can briefly enlighten it to us.
Okay. Thank you very much for this question. Basically, I'm just connecting to some elements already explained by Karine. These new enhancements were released at the beginning of July. And basically what happens is that now an organization is no longer associated to a very specific role of a business operator, laboratory, or third party, but it's possible for an organization to play different roles at the same time. And this was basically a strong request we have received from the user directly, I think already in December through the technical group on notification of study database. This change implied, the implementation of this change implied some changes also in the user interface. For example, an organization that now is acting as a business operator, as laboratory at the same time, or for example as third party, will see two buttons when accessing the notification of study function. We are talking about this notification of study function available directly from the study section. Another change that was, let's say, applied by the, and just to complete, the two buttons are to notify as applicant or to notify as a laboratory, because the two procedures are slightly different. Okay. The other change that this modification implied are small changes on the user interface. Now, basically, when you want to edit a study, you cannot do it anymore by clicking on the main 4, but you need to click on the edit button here. In addition, the operation of study notification, share with, and so on are no longer available in this button bar here, but they are accessible through the select option button that you see it here. And there, basically, when you click this button, you have the possibility to notify, withdraw, share. Of course, all these elements are explained in the new user manual that we have just released. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. I will ask now Sarah to come on stage for a question more related to the pre-submission advice. And the question from our user is, what is the intended length of time for EFSA to deliver the pre-submission advice to the applicant? Sarah, I don't see you live yet.
Yes, I'm
okay.
Here. Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you. I'm Sara De Berardis. I'm a scientific officer in the Applications Desk unit. Yes, regarding the length for EFSA to provide the advice, In case of general pre-submission advice, at receipt of the request, the first step for us is to perform an administrative check and inform the requester on whether the request is accepted or rejected. This first step takes up to 15 working days. In case the request is accepted, the advice is given within 15 working days from the acceptance of the request. This in case of written advice. However, EFSA may also decide, in specific case, to provide the advice during a meeting, and in this case, the meeting will be organized within 20 working days. This for what concerns the general pre-submission advice. In case of renewal pre-submission advice, the process takes a bit more time. As a first step, EFSA receives the list of intended studies for renewals and proceed with an administrative check. And this check may take up to 10 working days. EFSA may request at this stage clarification on the information notified and will set a deadline on the basis of the amount of information requested. And here I would like to stress the importance of providing all the requested information as complete as possible so that EFSA can provide a meaningful advice. From receipt of the requested information, EFSA has 10 working days to complete the check. Once the check is completed, the next step for EFSA is to launch the public consultation on the intended studies for renewals within 10 working days, and the consultation will remain open for 3 calendar weeks. At the closure of the consultation, EFSA reviews all comments received and will provide the renewal pre-submission advice within 30 working days from the closure of the consultation. So I hope this addresses the request, and back to you, Margherita.
Thank you, Sara. I think it was very clear, and for the interest of time, since we are reaching the end of almost the end of the webinar, I'd like to take a few more questions live. And for these ones, I would like to ask Simone to come on stage for, in particular, 2 questions on confidentiality, and I will quickly read them. The first one is, what happens when a non-confidential version of a file cannot be submitted?
Thank you, Margherita. Thank you very much indeed. In this case, we have to distinguish. We have to distinguish whether it is a technical issue that is due to the, for instance, temporary unavailability of ESFC, in which event the applicant may contact the service desk, or whether it is something related to the very format of the file that is to be uploaded. If there are issues with regard to the blackening or sanitization of the file to be uploaded, there are different software that are available commercially for the applicants to redact their files, and usually these are compatible with the vast majority of the file formats. So the applicants shall first verify and choose the most appropriate commercial solution and use it to redact and sanitize the file accordingly. Once sanitized, the file will be it will be possible for the applicant to upload the sanitized file online on the ESFC. If no such file is actually uploaded, this will be an issue in terms of compliance with the practical arrangements, and will first result in EFSA asking the applicant to submit the redacted file in accordance with the practical arrangements by using the procedure of the clarification to which I referred in my presentation. And if this is not possible and it is not done by the applicant by the prescribed timeline, then EFSA will have to reject the confidentiality request. So please take care to upload the sanitized version of the file of the information that is claimed confidential, because indeed this is a procedural requirement that is very much important for EFSA.
Many thanks, Simone. I'll take another question, so I will ask you to stay on stage for another one for you, which is, does a request to keep names confidential need any additional reasoning?
Thank you, Margherita. For this, we have to differentiate. In order to answer this question, we have to differentiate depending on the personal data in question. There are personal data that may not be disclosed and for which, therefore, no substantive justification is required. And these are the personal data that are mentioned in Article 39E, paragraph 2 of the General Food Law, Regulation 178 of 2002, as amended by the Transparency Regulation. And in particular, these are the names and addresses of natural persons involved in testing on vertebrate animals or in obtaining toxicological information. For the other personal data that the applicant would like to not to be disclosed, would like to prevent disclosure, the applicant is required to submit a justification explaining why the disclosure would be resulting in a harm to the privacy or integrity of the natural persons.
Thank you, Simone. Very last question before we close the webinar. I'd like to ask Karin to come on stage for a question on the tools we received from our audience. The question is, there are now 4 different systems in place for applicants, EFSA Connect, EFSA Open, ESFC, and Portalino. Is EFSA planning to introduce at some point one system for applicants in the EU? This is the question for you, and I will ask you to be brief since we are almost at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Question on the tool. So we have the majority of the tool, which is one, Salesforce for Connect EFSA, for Open EFSA, for Portalino, it's the same. But it's true that with the Commission, we have a different way of register. So the applicant for the moment have to register on the ESFC to submit their dossier, and then on EFSA to connect for accessing the different system. For the moment, that's where we are. And we can always take note of the future to try to have 1 entry point. But we really make an effort already within EFSA to have this centralization. Back to you, Margherita. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin, for your answer. I think we really need to close the webinar. We are almost at 12:30, actually now 12:30. So I'd like to thank you all speakers, thank you the Q&A contributors, and of course, and in particular our audience for attending our webinar, the second on feed additives applications. We hope you enjoyed, and especially you got the answers that you were looking for. As I was mentioning at the beginning, in case we did not manage to answer to all your questions, please feel free to resubmit them via the dedicated tool on the EFSA website. For those that already asked at the beginning of the webinar, note that there will be a recording. So this webinar is being recorded, so the recording will be available on the EFSA website for you to check the presentation as well as any answers provided by our team of EFSA colleagues. And with this very last slide, I'll ask you if you have a few more minutes to fill out our evaluation form to let us know how you found it, whether it was interesting, useful to you, and to provide any other useful feedback. Very final, here we just recap some of the main legal documents and all guidance and training materials which we believe are of interest and useful for you as a feed additives applicants and stakeholders. So we suggest you to carefully check all the documents available on the website, and to keep an eye on EFSA website also in the future, since as you noticed, there are some developments and frequent updates on the many aspects related to the transparency regulation. And with this, I thank you very much again for your attention and your attendance, and speak to you soon. Goodbye.